Welcome back. Last time, we wandered through the strange landscapes of memory and perception, places where reality bends quietly inside the mind. Tonight, we go deeper. Imagine being awake inside your own body, fully aware, yet unable to move a single muscle, or playing a game so long that it begins to play itself behind your eyelids. Imagine creating something or someone out of pure belief and then watching it come alive. These are not ghost stories or tales from distant worlds. They happen inside us, in the folds of thought, in the split second between what we see and what we think we see. In this collection, we'll visit the edge of consciousness, where perception, illusion, and imagination blur into one another. We'll meet the scientists who tested the mind until it spoke back, and the people who found themselves trapped inside their own. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what was the last thing you remember before sleep pulled you under. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A dim hospital room, curtain half drawn, monitors breathing in quiet rhythm. A man lies still, eyes open, the ceiling reflected in them like a calm lake. A nurse steps close and says his name. Nothing moves. Then she asks, "Can you look up if you hear me?" The pupils lift a few millimeters. The room does not change, but something has happened. Someone is home. This is the locked-in mind, conscious but unable to move. The phrase sounds like rumor, but it is a medical reality with a precise outline. Most cases begin suddenly. A clot lodges in the main artery feeding the base of the brain. The front portion of the brainstem, a narrow corridor that carries signals from the thinking brain down to the face, throat, and body, goes silent. The person remains awake. Memory, attention, and a sense of self are largely intact. But the wiring that moves muscles, the lines that let a thought become an action, are cut. The result is paralysis from the neck down, loss of speech, and an eerie contrast. A clear mind inside an almost motionless body. Doctors in the 1960s gave the condition a name that has lasted. It was described in careful prose by two neurologists who noted a pattern. People could not speak or move limbs, but they could look up and down and blink. Vertical eye movement and blinking use fibers that take a different path. Those paths often survive. That small mercy becomes a lifeline. The clinical picture can be traced step by step. It often begins late in the day, after dinner or during a quiet hour. The person feels sudden dizziness, sees double, tries to stand, and cannot. A family member calls for help. In the ambulance, the face may sag slightly, the speech slur, then stop. On arrival, the patient is intubated to protect breathing. Sedation blurs the first hours. When the drugs wear off, the staff calls the patient's name and presses a pen to the nail bed to test for a flinch. The limbs remain still. A scan the size of a washing machine takes pictures of the brain and shows a stroke in the brainstem. In a segment doctors call the pons. If a clot-dissolving drug was given early enough, Or if a catheter reached the clot and pulled it out, function can sometimes return. Often it does not. Now the detective work turns quiet, and it begins at the bedside. A nurse stands at the foot of the bed, where the patient can see her, and asks for a simple signal. Look up for yes, look down for no. This is repeated. The pattern must be solid, without guessing, without chance. The nurse asks, "Is your name Michael?" The patient looks up. "Are we in a library?" The eyes go down. "Do you feel pain?" Up or down, simple binary questions build the first bridge. Families learn quickly to keep questions precise, to allow extra seconds for the mind to send signals along small, surviving pathways to the muscles around the eyes. This is how communication starts for many people. A code of blinks and gaze. Sometimes there is a hint of movement in the face, or a small twitch in a thumb that can be trained into a switch. An alphabet board comes next. A helper points to groups of letters, A to E, F to J, and onward, while saying the groups aloud. The patient signals yes when the group containing the target letter is reached. The helper then points to each letter in that group one by one until the patient signals again. The letter is recorded, and the process repeats. Slow at first, often a few words an hour, but it adds up. One well-known writer produced an entire book this way, letter by letter, with patience and a partner who knew his timing and his eyes. The details matter because they guard against false hope and missed chances. A person who appears asleep all day may simply be bored, exhausted, or locked into a mind that has no way to turn outward. Conversely, a person who seems to respond may be drifting with reflexes that mimic choice. That is why teams use controlled tests. They mix easy questions with trick questions. They repeat them at different times of day. They ask for answers that can be checked, like, "Is your wife's name Anna, and is it winter now?" When a reliable pattern appears, a language is born. The central question that haunts families and clinicians alike is simple: what remains of the person inside? Reports converge. Many people who recover enough to speak or write later say they were fully aware, heard conversations in the room, felt touch and temperature on skin, and formed opinions and plans. Some describe waves of panic in the early days, then a shift into disciplined attention. They learn to breathe with the ventilator, to keep track of day and night, to listen for the clink of a cup or the stride of a shoe to know who was coming. They counted, recited poems or phone numbers, imagined moving their fingers to keep the memory of movement alive. They wanted, above all, to be asked questions that expected real answers. There is a neighboring landscape in medicine where this becomes complicated. People who show little movement and are presumed unaware might have hidden pockets of consciousness. Over the past 2 decades, researchers have used brain scans that track blood flow to ask silent questions. In a landmark series of tests, a team asked a man who had been called vegetative to imagine playing tennis if the answer to a yes or no question was yes, and to imagine walking through his home if the answer was no. The two mental pictures light different regions of the brain. In that narrow tunnel of a scanner, he answered yes and no to test questions in a consistent pattern. He then answered a personal question correctly. It was a quiet revolution. Even when eyes and face do not speak, intention can sometimes be seen indirectly. That result does not apply to everyone. Many who are unresponsive truly are unconscious. Others are in a minimally conscious state where awareness flickers and fades. Some early claims of silent communication have fallen apart under stricter testing, especially when a helper unconsciously guided the person's responses. That controversy, painful as it was, led to better protocols. Now, when a new technology is used to ask questions of a silent patient, whether eye-tracking cameras, small switches activated by a muscle in the cheek, or direct brain signals, teams build in verification, repeat sessions, and guardrails against wishful thinking. The locked-in picture itself has degrees. Classic cases retain vertical eye movement and blinking. Incomplete cases regain small motions in the head or fingers. The most severe, sometimes called total locked-in, leave no movement at all, not even a blink. In those rare instances, bedside testing is impossible. Only indirect measures, brain recordings that track electrical rhythms or blood flow, can suggest awareness. Even then, the line is not clean. A person might be able to follow a command in a scanner one day and fail the next, due to fatigue, a low-grade infection, or pain medication. That is why families and clinicians who know this territory keep checking at different times and in different ways. Why does it happen so often at the base of the brain? The anatomy sketches an answer. The thinking brain sits above, wide as two hands. Beneath it lie narrow tracks like cables that carry signals down and up. The front portion of that narrow stem is devoted to moving commands. When a clot blocks the artery that feeds this region, the upper brain remains intact. The person thinks and feels, but the outgoing commands cannot descend. The sensory paths that bring sight, sound, touch, and inner sense back up are partly preserved. So the person knows. They hear family at the bedside, the hiss of oxygen, the rattle of a linen cart. They notice the clock hands shifting. They cannot signal easily back. If you are building a clear chain that fits most of the facts, it might go like this. An otherwise ordinary day ends in a sudden stroke that shuts the corridor between thought and motion. In the first hours, sedation, a breathing tube, and the shock of the event make every test harder. As the medical storm calms, careful staff try simple, repeatable commands that rely on vertical gaze and blinks. A pattern is found. The family learns the code and brings a letterboard. A small dictionary grows on the bedside table. Names of people, lists of needs, jokes that only the family would understand. With time, a physiotherapist looks for tiny muscle potentials that might be trained into a switch. An eye-tracking camera arrives that reads gaze directly and speaks through a synthesized voice when a sentence is complete. Some people plateaus, some improve slowly. A few, treated very early with clot removal or clot dissolving medicine, regain a rough voice and small hand movements within months. Across all of these variants, the same principle holds. Sustained, reliable communication changes everything. There are broader questions that ride on this narrow condition. How many people are misdiagnosed as being beyond reach when they are not? Audits in specialized units suggest that careful screening finds more awareness than busy wards do. How should hospitals speak in rooms where someone may hear every word? Families often say later that the patient remembered who stayed late and who spoke as if they were not there. How far can technology go in giving the body back to the mind? Recent efforts have used signals from the motor areas of the brain to let a person type or move a cursor. Others have trained people to signal yes or no with shifts in blood flow that a scanner can read. These tools are not yet daily devices, but they point in one direction. Intention can sometimes be captured and delivered even when muscles cannot cooperate. Every field has its cautionary tales. Years ago, a widely reported case described a man believed to be locked in, who seemed to write sentences through a helper pointing to letters. Later, under tests that removed the helper's influence, the sentences vanished. The lesson was not that locked-in minds do not exist. It was that methods must be careful, reproducible, and designed to separate desire from data. It took that controversy to cement best practices in many clinics. There is a human rhythm to the lives that emerge after the shock. Routine anchors the days. Morning stretches, the alphabet board after breakfast, short sessions with the eye-tracking device, a call with a friend who has learned the timing of yes and no. Families adapt a living room into a control room, a laptop within gaze, a television with subtitles, lights arranged to avoid glare that tires the eyes. Literature sits close, not because it is an escape, but because language becomes the ladder out. People write, with help and relentless patience, not about tragedy, but about exact sensations. The warmth of sunlight through a window, the sound of a hallway radio, the relief of being understood after days of being missed. Picture that room again. A helper sits across from the bed with a board of letters. A to E, the eyes move up. The helper notes it. F to J, down. K to O, up O. The letters crawl into words. The words into sentences, and from those sentences come instructions, preferences, stories, and, eventually, a kind of normal, slower, precise, still alive. Outside, the world moves at its usual speed. Inside, the mind keeps time, patient and exact, waiting for each question to be asked in a way it can answer. The mystery here is not spectral. It is how a self can remain clear when almost every avenue of expression is sealed. The locked-in mind asks us to treat stillness as a signal, to test it carefully, and to respect what the eyes have to say. In the dim room, that first upward glance was not much to look at, but it was, for the person who made it, the beginning of being seen again. Some mysteries do not wait for darkness or distant places. They begin when you put a game down, turn off the screen, and the shapes keep falling anyway. They drift across the inside of your eyelids, line up on brick walls, and flash behind conversations. This is the Tetris Effect. when the brain can't stop playing. The story starts in a quiet room in Moscow in the mid-1980s. A young programmer built a puzzle on a machine not meant for games, just to see if he could. He arranged 4 block pieces that fell from above, the player rotating and slotting them into neat rows. The rules were simple, the pace quick, and the satisfaction sharp when a line disappeared. The program escaped the lab, crossed borders, and by the end of the decade was everywhere. On home computers, in arcades, and then in pockets when a small gray handheld made it mobile. People played on lunch breaks, in airports, on sofas, and late into the night. That is when the reports began. Grocery aisles looked like columns waiting to be cleared. Brick walls invited imaginary rotations. After long sessions, some people lay in bed, closed their eyes, and saw colored shapes drop into invisible chambers. The images were neither dream nor hallucination. They were brief, steady, and unmistakable. Players gave it a name that felt accurate and a little funny: the Tetris Effect. Scientists noticed the pattern and did what scientists do. They brought it into the lab and watched it carefully. In the late 1990s, a small team asked volunteers to play in the evening, then to lie down in a dark room and describe what flickered to life as they drifted towards sleep. They kept notebooks at the bedside. The notes were consistent. A gap 2 squares wide, left side. Long piece fits. Rotating an L-shaped block. These were not grand dreams. They were fragments, like mental still photos from a game that had just ended, only now the screen was the mind. Then the researchers did something meticulous. They invited people with a particular pattern of memory loss, the kind that makes it hard to form new, explicit memories of daily events, to try the same routine. These patients could not later describe playing the game. Yet when asked, as they dozed, what images came and went, they reported the same falling shapes. That detail mattered. It suggested the brain holds on to repeated experiences in more than one place. With some pathways storing the steps of a skill, even when the doorway to conscious recall is blocked. The pieces kept dropping in the mind of someone who could not remember why. Over the next years, psychologists widened the lens. A researcher who specialized in how games spill over into daily life surveyed players from many countries and many ages. Thousands answered. The pattern held. After long sessions of any repetitive, absorbing game, people saw images, heard loops of music, felt the tug of phantom buttons under their fingers. In one set of interviews, more than half of the players reported seeing game elements intrude as quick flashes while commuting, studying, or trying to fall asleep. Some heard music in the silence, often the bright, rushing melody now famous as the theme, even when no speakers were on. A few described the urge to mentally rotate real objects, like luggage and books, as if a neat stack might clear a line somewhere. The odd part, the effect was not just an aftertaste. In some studies, it appeared to do practical work. In one small trial in an emergency department, people who had just experienced a traumatic event were asked to spend a short time playing the puzzle. Over the following week, they reported fewer intrusive, vivid replay images of the trauma compared with those who did not play. The idea still being tested, is that a demanding visual task can compete with the formation of intense image-based memories if started soon after the event. In another line of research, a brief session reduced cravings for cigarettes, snacks, or alcohol for a short period, perhaps because the game occupied the same mental workspace the craving would otherwise fill. And in a clinical experiment in the early 2000s, scientists used the game in a novel way for vision therapy. By presenting different parts of the screen to each eye with colored filters, they engaged both eyes together, and adults with lazy eye improved. A simple puzzle had become a tool. So what is happening exactly when the shapes refuse to leave? Several explanations line up like pieces on a screen. One is replay. The brain is a rehearsal machine. After a day of practice, whether it is a scale on a piano, steps in a dance, or that swift rotation of a long bar, the mind revisits the pattern during quiet wakefulness and early sleep. The rehearsal is not a movie. It is more like snapshots of key positions and transitions. That is what people report in their notebooks. A corner that needs filling, the outline of an incoming piece, the brief satisfaction of a perfect fit. In labs that track brain activity during these twilight minutes, researchers see flickers in areas that normally handle spatial rotation and hand-eye coordination. The idea is not exotic. It is the same reason an athlete visualizes a move before attempting it. The brain keeps practicing, even without a coach. Another is adaptation. Stare at a waterfall for a minute, then look at rocks beside it, and you might see the rocks drift upward. A well-known motion after effect. Play a fast, grid-based puzzle for an hour, and your visual system becomes tuned to certain orientations and movements. When the game stops, that tuning does not instantly vanish. Vertical and horizontal lines in the real world may echo the game's grid, and the brain briefly fits falling shapes into that frame. The effect fades as the visual system resets to the broader world. A third is attention set. When focused on a task, we prime our minds to notice related features. A carpenter looks at a room and sees joins. A painter sees light. A driver watches for brake lights. A player who has spent the evening clearing lines is primed to spot gaps, alignments, and rotations. The supermarket shelf presents as a puzzle because the mind has set a filter that asks, where does this fit? The filter relaxes with time. Until it does, the question pops up everywhere. Supporters of these ideas point to common facts. The images are more frequent after long, absorbing sessions. They are strongest in the hours after stopping, fade by the next day, and usually vanish within a few nights. They appear in people who are not suggestible, and in those who cannot recall playing. They show up in many activities beyond this one game: a diver dreaming of ladders of bubbles, a climber feeling handholds while falling asleep, a doctor hearing beeps on a day off because 20 hours in a ward trained the ear. The Tetris Effect is the cleanest, most shared example because the rules are simple and the shapes are distinct. Skeptics raise good points. Surveys rely on self-report and invite people who have something to say. Ask thousands, and you will find many striking stories. That does not reveal how common the experience truly is. In small lab studies, the sample sizes are slim, the settings artificial, and the subjects, often students, demand characteristics. The tendency to give an experimenter what you think they want might inflate positive reports. And in studies where the game seems to help with cravings or intrusive images, the results are promising but modest, sensitive to timing, and still being tested in larger, more diverse groups. Still, the pattern is hard to ignore. If you build a simple chain of events from what we have, it looks like this. A person plays for an hour or two. Their eyes and hands learn to coordinate a fast sequence. Look, rotate, place, clear. The music loops and the grid burns into a temporary map. When they finally stop, the mind keeps the rehearsal going at a low level. As they approach sleep, the threshold where images become loose and ideas float, the rehearsal becomes visible for a minute. Not a dream yet, not quite waking thought. During the next day, primed attention and a tuned visual system nudge ordinary scenes into game-like frames. Then, unless the person continues to play for many hours every day, the effect fades. The circuits rebalance to the broader demands of life: faces, words, streets, and chores. There are outliers. A small number of people report more intense spillover. Hearing the game's tune loudly, seeing shapes overlaid on real scenes for days. In most cases, this tracks with extreme playtime and high immersion. When they take breaks, sleep more, and step outside into complex, varied environments, the effect softens. Clinicians watching for problems usually find none beyond annoyance and distraction. The images do not command behavior. They are more like an afterglow. Even the name has grown beyond its origin. The Tetris Effect now describes any situation in which a repeated pattern takes hold so firmly that it edits perception and dreams. A traveler reading a foreign language all day closes her eyes and sees lines of script drift by. A coder who spends a week on a problem watches brackets and loops float in the shower. A chess player sees the board in a tiled floor. The mind is an efficient machine. It optimizes for what it thinks you need. Is there anything mystical in it? Probably not. But there is something quietly revealing. The effect shows how practice settles into layers. One layer learns the facts and rules, the score and the shapes. Another learns motions, timings, and the feel of success. Those layers talk to different parts of the brain and linger for different lengths of time. That is why the patient who cannot recall playing can still see falling blocks. It is why a short game can occupy the space that a craving would have used. And it is why, for a few minutes after you stop, the world itself looks like a puzzle that wants solving. If you walk back through the years, you will find echoes of this long before the handheld, long before the mid-'80s lab in Moscow. Sailors on long voyages reported dreaming of waves. Telegraph operators heard phantom clicks on quiet evenings. Climbers woke reaching for holds. The difference now is that a small, tidy game gave everyone a shared language to describe it, a simple image to point to, and a catchy name that made the file easy to pull from memory. There is one final footnote worth placing carefully. Some writers use the Tetris Effect to claim large, sweeping truths, that games rewire minds in irreversible ways, or that a single session can erase trauma. The measured view is calmer. The mind is plastic and local. Short tasks have short effects. Repeated practice builds longer ones. A game can nudge, distract, rehearse, and sometimes help, especially when used thoughtfully in the right window. Most of the time, it is a passing visitor that tells us something about how attention, memory, and perception share a crowded house. Picture the end of a long day. The device goes dark. The room returns to ordinary shapes, shelves, windows, the steady corner of a table. Behind closed eyes, one more line clears. One more piece settles. Then the grid dissolves and the room is only a room again. Somewhere in a quiet part of the mind, the rehearsal winds down, ready to start if asked, content to rest if not. The Tetris Effect does not haunt. It explains, gently, how practice leaks into the hours around it, how a simple puzzle can cast a neat, temporary shadow over the world and then step aside. Sometimes the best work arrives when nothing dramatic seems to happen. No triumphal music, no big announcement, just a steadier breath, a narrowing of choices, and a task that begins to carry itself. That is how people describe the moments when time loosens and the sense of me steps back. This is the flow state, when time and self disappear. The modern story of flow starts in the second half of the 20th century with a quiet question. Why does deep engagement feel so good? A researcher, listening to painters forget to eat while finishing a canvas, to rock climbers who spoke of long routes as if they had taken only a few minutes, and to chess players who barely noticed the room around them, began to collect evidence. In the late 1970s and into the 90s, he and his colleagues handed out small devices that buzzed at random times. When the signal arrived, participants wrote down exactly what they were doing and how it felt: bored, anxious, or absorbed. The logs that came back after weeks of daily life were plain but striking. People felt most alive when the challenge in front of them matched what they could almost, but not quite, do. The entries used similar words: focused, clear goals, immediate feedback, a quiet sense of control, time doing something odd, stretching or compressing, and a self carried along by the work rather than standing aside, judging it. That pattern showed up in places that did not look alike. A violinist practicing scales described an hour that seemed to vanish. A surgeon closing a complex wound described a kind of tunnel attention. All information relevant, nothing extra. A long-distance runner on a flat road said the mile markers felt closer together. Not because she ran faster, she said, but because her attention stopped leaking away to unrelated thoughts. A software developer logged his day and found 2 blocks, each about 90 minutes long, when he typed steadily with few corrections, then looked up to find the sun had shifted across the floor. There are more specific records. In one small mountain town, guidebooks describe a climber on a 3,000-foot wall who rehearsed the hand sequence of a crux section for months. On the day of the ascent, his partner timed the move out of habit, Later, the climber reported the entire sequence as a single smooth phrase, almost without individual holds. The recorded time was under a minute. To him, it was only a moment, containing everything. Track coaches talk about an athlete's quiet eye, a steady gaze a breath longer than usual just before release. When archers and free throw shooters are filmed in slow motion, the eyes settle early, the arm follows, and the mind seems to ride inside the motion rather than manage it from above. In laboratory settings that try to mimic those moments, musicians improvising in a scanner show a pattern that is simple to say, even if the machine images look complex. Regions that plan and watch the self are less loud. Regions that sequence actions are more engaged. And the rhythm centers that keep time for movement hum along steadily. The explanation offered by many researchers goes like this. As workload smooths into practiced action, the parts of the brain that compare, evaluate, and criticize reduce their chatter, which feels like the self stepping back, while the circuits that pair perception and action strengthen their handshake. You do not vanish. You get out of your own way. The path into flow is oddly narrow and robust at once. Most descriptions fall into the same three conditions. First, the goal is concrete and near term. One more line of code, the next hold, the next paragraph. Second, the feedback is immediate. Every keystroke compiles or does not. The shoe grips or skids. The sentence reads clean or clumsy. Third, the challenge sits right against your capacity, not easy enough to drift, not so hard that you break form. Set those three, and the mind does something reliable. It narrows the field to here and now, quiets optional commentary, and gives you the feeling of being carried by the task. Because it is so embodied, flow can be measured indirectly. In small studies, heart rates in skilled performers do not always spike. Instead, they settle into a rhythmic pattern with fewer stutters. Breathing follows suit. Pupils dilate slightly, a sign of alert engagement. When researchers add interruption, a sudden noise, a question asked mid-task, people in flow often miss it entirely or react with a small delay, then return to the task as if tugged by a line. In diaries, people write that interruptions feel like someone switched on a light in a dark room. The image is sharp, then flattened. The mystery grows when time enters the picture. Some fields show compressed time. The often reported hours felt like minutes. Others show stretch time, especially in sports where milliseconds matter. A goalkeeper, for a few seconds, sees the ball as if it moves through thick air, slow enough to plan a hand path that cannot actually be planned in real time. One explanation says the brain is not actually running faster, but that attention is so completely focused on task-relevant segments that memory records more milestones within the same seconds. Later, recalling those marked points gives the impression of slow motion. The reverse happens during hours of work that feel like minutes. The attentional switch marks only a few points, and recall compresses everything in between. Why does it feel so good? The modest answer points to chemistry that rewards survival behaviors. exploring just beyond the known, testing new routes, practicing skills to the point of reliability. A gentle pulse of rewarding signals encourages you to keep going. But there is a psychological layer as well. Flow sits in the sweet spot between boredom and anxiety. In that narrow band, the brain wastes less energy on self-monitoring and redirects that power to the movement or the line of thought at hand. The feeling that follows, of being matched to a moment, is naturally satisfying. Theories multiply, and each carries evidence and challenges. The first and most cited is the match between challenge and skill. Supporters point to thousands of diaries, experiments with random prompts, and field notes from coaches and conductors. When the task is too easy, attention wanders. When too hard, self-consciousness rises. Critics reply that much of this relies on self-report, and that in controlled tasks that attempt to dial difficulty, true deep flow is rare and hard to trigger on command. Another theory emphasizes the quieting of internal monitoring. Researchers call it a temporary reduction in the regions that keep score on the self. Evidence comes from brain imaging studies of improvising musicians and experienced meditators who enter similar states of self-silencing focus. A challenge here is that different teams find different patterns depending on the task and the person. The brain is a busy place, not a single switch. A third theory focuses on learning and prediction. According to this view, flow appears when the brain's predictions about what will happen next line up closely with the world, and the small errors between prediction and feedback arrive at a pace that is neither too thin nor too chaotic. Each small correction feels meaningful, so the learning system stays engaged. The counterpoint is that this is a broad description that fits many situations and explains little about when and why you fall out of flow abruptly. A phone buzz, a stray thought, a small doubt, and suddenly the task becomes a task again. There is a social variant often called group flow, the way a jazz quartet, a surgical team, or a seasoned rescue unit can move as if thinking with one mind. In such teams, cues are tight, roles clear, and feedback immediate. One player leads, another supports, and power shifts smoothly without a spoken word. The risk is romanticizing it. Not every team finds it, and structure matters. Good leaders create conditions for it, clear signals, unambiguous goals, time protected from needless noise, but cannot force it. There are also places where flow resists easy labels. Some people find it in what looks from the outside like repetitive, even dull work, kneading dough, planing wood, carefully cleaning a lens. Here, the skill ceiling is not obvious, yet practitioners describe a steady stretch of attention and a calm sense that time has thinned. Perhaps the challenge shifts inward toward precision, consistency, and small refinements that are deeply satisfying to the hand and eye. A few unusual details add texture. In one hospital trial, trauma patients played a visually demanding puzzle in the hours after a difficult event. A week later, they reported fewer intrusive replay images. The effect was modest but suggestive. A focused visual task might occupy the mental workspace usually used by unwanted flashbacks. a cousin to flow's steady hold on attention. In vision therapy experiments, games that require coordinated attention improved certain deficits when used thoughtfully. None of this proves that flow cures anything. It does suggest that the same conditions that produce deep engagement can be harnessed in small ways to reshape what the mind pays attention to. Skeptics ask useful questions. Is flow just a tidy name for practice and absorption? Do we make too much of a pleasant feeling that arrives when work goes well? What about choke? The painful opposite when attention gets in the way and performance collapses. Studies of choking show that self-monitoring can overwhelm learned sequences, lending weight to the idea that silencing that monitor sometimes helps. But it also shows that stress, novelty, and stakes can drag attention back in unwanted ways. If we assemble a careful chain of events from what is known, it might look like this. A person sets a clear, near-term goal in a context where feedback is quick and clean. The task sits near the edge of their current skill, so it demands full attention, but not panic. As the work begins, routines learned through practice take over, freeing the mind from narrating each move. Self-monitoring eases back. The sense of being the doer quiets, replaced by the sense of doing. Time perception drifts, either stretching within seconds, where the brain marks more precise moments, or compressing across hours, where the brain marks only milestones. When the task is interrupted or completed, the world broadens again, sometimes with a gentle afterglow of satisfaction and a surprising clarity about what to do next. There is a practical coda. People who find flow regularly do not stumble into it by accident. They arrange their conditions, they block time, remove needless alerts, prepare tools beforehand, warm up with easier runs, and set markers to measure progress. They respect the fine line between challenge and overwhelm, and they take breaks before the quality slips, so the mind returns eager rather than exhausted. When they work with others, they agree on signals, roles, and simple goals. None of this guarantees flow. It does raise the odds. Picture it without drama. A desk lamp on in a quiet room, a blank page waiting, or a long stretch of road steady underfoot. The phone is face down. The next marker is close enough to see. Breath, task, and a body that knows what to do meet in a small, ordinary present. Time does whatever it wants. The sense of self sits back just enough to let the work through. And when the moment ends, there is no thunderclap. Just a feeling that something lined up well, and might again if you make the space for it. Autumn, 1972. A quiet living room in Toronto. A round table, 8 chairs, a stack of notes about a man who never lived. The group gathered after work, set a single lamp low, and placed their fingertips lightly on the wood. They were not hoping to find a ghost. They were hoping to make one. What came next would be talked about for years as the Philip experiment, creating a ghost with the mind. The idea was straightforward and bold. A small circle of volunteers from a local society that studied unusual experiences wanted to test whether shared imagination could produce the signs people often attributed to spirits. knocks, movements, answers to questions. They would not seek an unknown presence, they would build one. Together, they wrote a detailed biography for a man they named Philip Aylesford, giving him a coat of arms, a home, a time, and a tragic arc. They made him an English nobleman from the 1700s, married but unhappy, falling in love with a woman who met a cruel end. They decided his moods, his tastes, even the sound of his footsteps on a stone hall. One member sketched his face, short hair, neat mustache, intelligent eyes. The portrait was pinned to the wall above the table, a focus for attention. Each week, often in the evening, they met. In the early months, they followed a careful routine: bright lights, no theatrics, no talk of seances. They discussed Philip's life out loud, memorized it, and asked for simple responses. 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. They waited and logged the silence. For months, nothing happened. They wrote in their notes that the room felt too strict and a little flat. If the mind was going to do anything unusual, they thought, it might need a different kind of setting. So they changed the mood. The group dimmed the lights and put the portrait where everyone could see it. They sat closer, fingertips barely touching the wood, shoulders relaxed. Someone brought candy, someone else suggested they sing. Popular songs, light conversation, and a shared sense of play replaced the clinical hush. Around 9 on one of those nights, the first sharp sound came from the table. A single knock, crisp and close like a knuckle under the surface. The room went very still, and then another knock, quick as if answering a joke. The notes from that evening mark the time, the pattern, and the sudden lift in everyone's attention. From that night on, the sessions developed a rhythm. The group asked questions about Philip's invented life. Did he live near the sea? Was he faithful to his wife? Did he ride with a particular regiment? The knocks came almost immediately, 1 for agreement, 2 for denial, sometimes a rolling series that felt impatient. They tried real-world questions outside Philip's story. The day of the week, the capital of a distant country. Responses fell apart. The pattern was clear. The answers were strong when they asked within the boundaries they had created, weak or nonsensical when they asked beyond them. Physical events followed. The round table began to tremble, the vibrations building from a faint shiver to a steady tapping under resting fingertips. Witnesses described a cool breath across their hands, as if a small draft had found its way under the door, though the windows were closed and the air in the room had been still. On some nights, the table would tilt onto one leg and spin a few degrees, holding its balance longer than made sense to the people watching their own hands. It sometimes seemed to nudge toward a specific person and stop in front of them, as if to say, "You next." The logs show that the better nights shared a pattern. The room was friendly, the questions were clear, the group was united in tone. When they argued or slipped into long gaps of silence, the sounds faded. When they laughed or sang, the table behaved. At one session, they sang a marching song from the same century they had given Philip, clapping lightly to the beat. The knocks joined in perfect time, as if a drummer under the floorboards had woken and decided to play. The group took care to rule out simple causes. They placed the table on a thick carpet and later on a hard floor. They watched each other's feet and kept them back from the legs. They tried placing thin pads under the tips of their fingers so pressure would be obvious. They asked the sound to come from a wall rather than the table. And a knock arrived from the wood paneling a few feet away. When they switched the light off completely, the table's movements increased. They reacted by raising the lamp a little and noting that the activity dimmed but did not disappear. The effects were fussy, but repeatable in broad outline. Word spread. A Canadian television crew set up equipment in the room for a sequence that would later be used in a documentary about the attempt. They filmed the group around the table, recorded the knocks, and captured a brief tilt onto one leg. Later, the group held a public sitting with an audience. The conditions were not laboratory tight, but they were bright and watched. People in the front rows said they heard the knocks clearly. The table moved enough to keep a skeptical crowd paying attention. A book followed, written by two of the organizers, collecting notes, observations, and diagrams of the table's positions during the most active sessions. They were not shy about stating the limits. Philip never told them anything they had not, in some form, already decided. When the questions drifted to testable facts outside the story they had made, the answers collapsed. The best nights depended on group mood, pacing, and a willingness to lean into the premise together. None of that sounded like an independent consciousness. Still, the table moved. Other groups tried similar projects. In the same city, a second circle created a different character and reported many of the same phenomena. Knocks in time with questions, a feeling that the table warmed to the right kind of attention and cooled to skepticism delivered too sharply. In another country, students invented the backstory of a young girl and for a while recorded responsive raps straight out of the 15-minute sessions they shaped as a game. The geography changed, but the recipe looked familiar. A shared fiction, a table, a light tone, and phenomena that stayed inside the lines. Once the wider attention arrived, so did careful critics. Stage magicians, who make a living with misdirection and leverage, gave demonstrations of table movements using nothing more than subtle shifts in finger pressure and small, synchronized changes in posture. A tiny sideways push on a rim, combined with a forward lean, could lift a light table onto a single leg and keep it there. When the lean reversed in unison, the table returned to the floor as if obeying a hidden rhythm. No wires were necessary, only timing and the confidence that people do not notice micro-movements when they expect to see stillness. Psychologists pointed to the ideomotor effect, the same phenomenon behind moving pointers on alphabet boards and swinging pendulums that seem to steer themselves. When people expect emotion, the body often supplies just enough micro-muscle activity to make that motion happen without conscious intent. In a group, these tiny efforts can add up, and feedback, both visual and social, can align them. The Philip sessions fit that pattern cleanly. The group's best results came when expectation, enjoyment, and coherence were high. The knocks that seemed to come from the table might have been produced mechanically by flexing wood, a shifted foot, or a subtle tap masked by conversation. The cool breeze could have been air pushed by the rising table, or a temperature gradient near the floor. Supporters of a stronger interpretation answered that some events seemed to break those explanations. People reported knocks that came from a wall several feet away, light bulbs that dimmed on request, and a table that chased a participant to the edge of the room. They noted that the group allowed outside observers and filmed sessions. If it was all unconscious leaning and wishful hearing, they asked, why did certain tricks work only when the invented man was invited in explicitly, and fail when the group dropped the backstory? There is a middle view that treats the case as a study in how people make meaning together. In this reading, the group's invention served as a flag for attention. The details of Philip's life were a scaffolding that allowed 8 minds to act as one moving system. Within that system, tiny impulses synchronized and amplified. A knock from the wood, a flicker from a loose dimmer, the small lift of a table leg. These became answers because the group had built a narrow channel for what counted as an answer. The effect was not fraudulent, but it was emergent rather than external. An intelligence of the room rather than a man from the past. Rare details bring that to ground. Participants wrote that the presence, if you want to call it that, had preferences. He liked certain songs and ignored others. He spoke for stretches, then went quiet after a few skeptical jokes landed too hard. Bright light in their notes acted like a dampener. When the experimenters tried to pin him down with tests that felt too cold, counting the gaps between knocks, asking for exact names and dates, the table seemed to sulk. But when they asked Philip to tap out a rhythm, or to answer questions about the story they had written for him, the knocks came lively and quick. Even as they marveled, the organizers wrote, the boundaries were obvious. Where you land depends on what kind of mystery you find satisfying. If you prefer clean lines, the ideomotor effect answers a great deal. The group set conditions that encouraged coordinated micro-movements. The table was light and easy to tip. The knocks were ambiguous, and human attention is good at hearing patterns in uneven noise. The more memorable incidents, dimming lights, a sense of a breeze, are the kinds of things buildings and bodies do under stress and expectation. If you are open to mind over matter accounts, the Philip experiment can read as a small, controlled case of psychokinesis, a group focus producing physical effects intertwined with the story that gave that focus shape. It would not be the first time stories and objects tangled in surprising ways. The counterpoint is that under strictly controlled blinded conditions, hands off the table, observers who do not share the premise, the effects fail to hold. There is one last question that the group kept circling in their notes. They wondered whether the point of the project was more modest than it sounded. What if they had not created a ghost at all? What if they had created a tool, an agreed-upon way for a group to talk to itself, to sharpen expectation, to coordinate action without language, and to enjoy the feeling of something answering back in return? That image is less dramatic than a face in the window, but it fits the evidence as well as any other. If you visit the archived materials, you can see the portrait. a man who never was, drawn in clean lines, intelligent and calm. You can read the logs, the date, the time of night, the song titles, the number of knocks. You can watch a few minutes of grainy film where the table tips and returns. And you can imagine the room during a good session. 8 adults with their hands on a simple piece of furniture, listening for a sound, then laughing when it arrives in perfect rhythm. The house is quiet now. The table long since moved. The chairs returned to daily use. Somewhere in a file box, on a yellowed page, an entry records a small answer. 1 sharp knock for yes. What that sound meant is still open. The rest is a steady room, a made-up man, and the curious way attention can turn imagination into something that feels like touch. The monitor should have been blank, the chair ordinary, the room uneventful. Instead, a faint light flickered at the edge of a man's vision. A place he swore was dark, and his hand rose unbidden to point toward it. He said he saw nothing. Still, he was right more often than not. This is the blind sight phenomenon, seeing without seeing. It began to take shape as a formal mystery in the 1970s, in quiet testing rooms with paper charts clipped to the sides of clipboards. A man known in the research notes by initials had lost part of the back surface of his brain after a medical procedure. That back surface is the primary visual cortex, a thin sheet that maps what the eyes bring in. After his surgery, a wedge of the world went dark for him. When he looked straight ahead and a researcher showed shapes on a screen to his damaged side, he said calmly and without hesitation, "Nothing." When they asked him to guess, just to humor them, he did. He chose left or right, up or down, circle or square. He was correct 6 or 7 times out of 10. The logs list the steps. Eyes fixed on a central cross. A small dot flashes in the blind field for a fraction of a second. The subject reports no sighting, then gives a forced choice guess. Tally marks crawl down the page. Correct, correct, incorrect, correct. The researchers tried slower flashes, faster ones, brighter, dimmer. They asked about motion and orientation, about lines and edges. The pattern remained. If they let him rate his confidence, he kept it low. If they made him choose anyway, the statistics tilted upward. He was, by his own account, in the dark. Yet his brain answered as if some narrow path still carried light. More cases followed. A teenager struck by a car in the late 1970s lost a wide swath of the visual map in 1/2 of his view. Years later, in testing, he still reported emptiness there. But when the screen showed moving lines instead of still ones, he performed better. He guessed the direction of motion at rates well above chance, even while insisting he was guessing. In older medical notes, a war physician had named a related effect after himself. A person might miss a slow, stationary object, yet notice a quick movement gliding by. That old observation found new footing. Motion seemed to slip through where detail did not. Around 2008, a university team in the Netherlands worked with a man who had lost nearly all primary visual processing on both sides after strokes. On paper, his world should have been almost entirely black. In a simple experiment, the team placed boxes and chairs down a long hallway, roughly 8 meters from one end to the other. They asked the man to walk straight, arms at his sides, no cane, no trial runs. He moved forward and watched nothing. Then his body curved, subtle and smooth. He edged between a chair and a box, shifted around a wastebasket, and angled through the last gap without a tap. When he reached the far wall, he shrugged and said he had not seen a thing. Behind these stories sits a simple question that unfolds complexity. How can a person act on visual information while denying that anything was seen? The laboratory answers began with anatomy. The main route for sight runs from the eyes through the brain's relay station, then to that broad map at the back of the head. Damage there erases conscious picture-making. But the eyes also send signals along older side roads, through a cluster in the midbrain and onto regions that track motion, shape, and emotion. Those routes are not the usual ones we rely on when we look at a face or read a sign. They are quicker, rougher, and less tied to inner commentary. They can guide a hand or a step, even when the person guiding feels nothing like seeing. The testing rooms filled with refinements. Researchers drew careful maps of each person's blind field using pinpoint lights and simple questions. They controlled for stray reflections and any hints that might float in from the good side. They moved stimuli to erase the chance of cheating through tiny eye movements. Some asked the blind sight field to tell them if a face on the screen looked fearful or calm. The person in the chair denied seeing a face at all, yet the body answered with a small rise in heart rate to the fearful ones and a skin response that signaled arousal. Functional brain scans, not discussed much in those early years, later showed activation in regions that respond to emotion, despite the person reporting no sight. Details kept accumulating. The pupil in the damaged eye still tightened when bright shapes appeared in the blind field, even though the subject said the field stayed dark. A hand reached faster toward a target placed there than to an empty spot, even when the person thought they were guessing a location. People with the phenomenon could catch the direction of a looming object's approach before they recognized anything like a thing. Motion helped. Contrast helped. Static, low-contrast shapes did not. Some tried to push the line between blindness and a whispered impression. A subset of participants reported that while they did not see an object, they felt something. A flicker, a tug, a nudge in a particular direction. Researchers started to call this a second flavor. A version where a person had no image but did have a fragile sense that something was there. It was not quite sight, but it was not nothing. Training sometimes made that whisper stronger. Weeks of practice nudged their performance higher. People learned to trust a bodily hint they could not name. The theories array themselves like a set of tools on a table, each explaining part of the work. The most cited one holds that islands of viable tissue remain after damage, and those islands connect to downstream regions that carry on without permission from the primary map. Supporters point to scans that show tiny patches of spared cortex and to behavior that clusters tightly in specific spots of the field. The counters are straightforward. Careful tests sometimes find no useful islands. A person with very extensive loss still avoids obstacles. If tiny remnants explain some cases, they do not explain all. Another theory centers on the older midbrain root. That path is known to help orient to sudden movement and to feed coarse information to areas that process motion and basic shape. It runs fast and it runs quietly. It fits the data that show strong responses to moving lines and looming shapes. It fits the emotional effects too. Signals can reach the brain's fear center without passing through the usual corridors. When a fearful face appears in the blind field, the body may prepare, even if the person remains unaware. The reservations come from the opposite direction. The root is basic, and the world is rich. It is not built to read text or parse fine detail, which is consistent with what the subjects cannot do. But some blind sight tasks seem to push beyond motion, suggesting that a patchwork of surviving roots is at work, not just one. Skeptical voices add necessary friction. They note that forced choice tasks can be vulnerable to subtle cues. A slight sound from a projector, a vibration from a response pad, a pattern of timing that gives away a sequence. These can tilt a person to guess better than chance. When experiments correct for those leaks, performance sometimes falls. The answer is not to dismiss, but to tighten the screws. The most careful studies counterbalance timing, dampen sound, check eye position, and randomize beyond human prediction. In those, the above chance guessing persists for a substantial number of trials in many subjects. Not all. Enough. A different thread suggests that blind sight is less about vision and more about access to what we saw. In this reading, the brain constructs many drafts of the world at once. Some drafts reach language and self-report. Others remain buried, but still affect movement and feeling. The damage in the back of the brain may block the route to explicit description while leaving other routes open. That view gains support from a simple flip of the design. In healthy volunteers, if you silence a patch of the visual map for an instant, using magnetic pulses aimed from outside the skull, people miss sights they would normally catch. Ask them to guess, though, and their guesses tilt toward the truths their conscious minds just missed. They say they saw nothing and still point in the right direction more often than not. The effect is shallow and brief, but it hints at the same divide. There are odd corners. People with blind sight can sometimes track a slowly turning line if they have already latched onto its motion, but cannot tell you which way the line leans when it freezes. Some can better sense flicker at certain rates, perhaps because those rates match what the older pathways like. A few report flashes of color or something like it that do not behave like color in the intact field. These details do not overturn the core. They add texture. Even in loss, the visual system is not a single road. It is a network. Damage reroutes traffic. What reaches awareness is only part of what is moving. Over the years, rehabilitation specialists have turned some of this mystery into practice. They set up training regimes to teach people with partial loss to widen their scanning and to become more efficient with the glimpses that remain. There are devices that use subtle vibrations to mark a target's location, and, with time, these assist people in orienting more quickly. None of this restores normal sight. It does show that the brain, given routine and feedback, can lean on leftover pathways and improve the use of what it has. For those who prefer boundaries to blur less, there is a final note about the nature of evidence here. Blind sight is not a rumor from a deserted road or a ship with no crew. It is a laboratory phenomenon with decades of replications and a chain of careful experiments. Still, within that frame, there is a quiet debate about how far it reaches. Some cases are clear and strong, others are marginal, falling apart when conditions change. A few classic observations, like strikes around objects without any obvious cues, have faced scrutiny about how tidy those rooms really were and whether anticipation played a bigger role than described. The broad shape stands. The edges remain under inspection. If you collect the field notes and the hallway videos, and the slow heartbeats next to fearful faces, you arrive at a picture that is plain and strange at once. We are not single selves looking out through simple windows. We are layered systems, some parts loud, some quiet, many running in parallel. The door to awareness can be partly closed, while the body navigates a path it claims not to see. Picture that long hallway again, boxes and chairs, a wastebasket in the path, pale walls. A man stands at one end with his hands at his sides. He takes a breath and steps forward, guided not by a scene in his mind's eye, but by signals that never become a picture. He does not slow for the first obstacle. His shoulder turns a degree or two, just enough. He passes it, then arcs again, small and precise. When he reaches the far wall, he touches it lightly, as if to confirm what his eyes did not, and says, in a steady voice, that he saw nothing at all. In that quiet gap between report and action, the mystery of seeing without seeing makes its home. Most moments pass through us and leave nothing behind. But some experiences, it is said, might leave marks deeper than memory, marks that travel past the life of one person and into the next. This is the story of the genetic memory hypothesis, knowledge before birth. The idea has a simple surface and a complicated center. It proposes that a life can carry more than eye color and height from its parents. It suggests that traces of experience might ride along as well, echoes of fear or preference, a scent that feels known, a path that seems familiar for no clear reason. It sounds like myth. And yet, over the past few decades, careful experiments and hard histories have given the hypothesis a set of facts to sit with, even as strong skeptics stand nearby. Begin in a quiet lab in Atlanta a little after 2010. A team works with mice in small chambers, the kind with metal grid floors that can deliver a mild shock to the feet. The ritual is simple and repeatable. A scent enters the air, a clean, sweet smell used in perfumes, and within seconds a faint shock arrives. The mice learn quickly to brace for it. Heart rate rises, a startle reflex grows, the scent alone now marks danger. Here is where the logbook widens. The trained males are allowed to breed with females that never saw the experiment. Their offspring grow up never smelling that perfume in the home cage and never receiving the pairings of scent and shock. When, as adults, those offspring meet that same scent for the first time in the testing chamber, many of them show a heightened fear response. They flinch harder than other mice. In the fine structure of their brains, more neurons respond to that particular smell. If the line continues one more generation, some of the grandchildren do it too. Supporters call this a blueprint for how experience might leave a physical note on the body's genetic machinery and pass it forward. They point to chemical tags that sit on the genetic code like bookmarks, marks that change how active certain genes become without changing the letters themselves. They note that those tags can be altered by stress and can, in some cases, slip through the usual erasure that happens early in development. They also note that in the mouse study, the effect tracked the father's line, which helps rule out the simple idea that the mother's body primed the fetus with hormones during pregnancy. The counterpoints come just as quickly. Mouse fear conditioning is a controlled, narrow setup. Life in the world is not. And even in that controlled room, subtle influences can creep in. Maybe the trained males behaved differently with their mates. Maybe scent clung to their fur. The strongest versions of the experiment used careful breeding steps to strain out those leaks. Yet arguments about invisible holes in the controls have not fully gone quiet. Move to a harsh winter in Western Europe in the middle of 1944. Food lines stretch, children shrink, women carry pregnancies through scarcity. Decades later, medical records show that children who were in the womb during the famine often grew into adults with higher risks of diabetes and heart disease. For some, the effect seemed to extend to their children, who also faced altered risk, even though they were born years after the hunger lifted. Biologists studied the genes that guide growth and metabolism and reported persistent chemical marks on them in those who faced the famine. Marks not seen in the same way in brothers and sisters born before or after. The picture that emerges is not one of a memory of a particular day or smell, but of an inherited leaning, a body tuned toward storing calories because the grandparent's body had survived a season when calories disappeared. The thread of trauma runs parallel. In New York, a group of psychiatrists and geneticists interviewed the adult children of people who endured the camps in the 1940s. The children had never been there. Many grew up in ordinary apartments, went to ordinary schools. The interviews and blood tests suggested differences in how their stress hormone system responded to challenge, and the group reported chemical marks on certain stress-related genes that differed from control groups. Arguments followed. Sample sizes were modest. Families share more than blood. They share stories, anxieties, and silences. A child learns to brace when a parent flinches. How much of that is carried in the body's code and how much rides on the air in the kitchen? If you place those human findings next to animal work, the outline sharpens a bit. In one experiment with garden snails of the sea, shocked to learn that a touch meant danger, A team extracted genetic messenger molecules from the trained animals and injected them into naive ones. The recipients showed an exaggerated defensive reflex as if they had been trained. The result drew bright headlines, then slower replies. Other labs tried to copy the effect and struggled. Pooled molecules can be messy. Contamination and stress chemistry can be hard to rule out. Still, the study sits as a marker for the most radical version of the hypothesis that the building blocks inside a cell might carry not just a framework for a brain, but a trace of what that brain felt. There are older, stranger stories from the time of black and white journals. Flatworms were taught to choose a light or dark path by pairing one choice with food. Then those trained worms were chopped and regenerated. The new heads sometimes seemed to remember what the old heads had learned. More curious still, when untrained worms were fed the bodies of trained ones, a common way to recycle nutrients in a worm lab, some observers reported that the eaters learned faster. Critics pushed back hard and rightly. Small labs, few animals, inconsistent methods. Decades later, with better controls and automated video scoring, a few groups have reported that a form of memory persists in worm tissue after decapitation, but the effect is narrow and the field remains divided. The lesson is less that memory can move with a meal, and more that the body stores traces in many places, not only in the obvious ones. What do we really mean when we say knowledge before birth? Some knowledge is simply the old wisdom of the species, written through long selection, not personal experience. Newborn humans settle their gaze on faces more readily than on patterns. Infants show quick attention to images of snakes and spiders compared with flowers and trucks, even if they have never seen a snake in the room. These are not memories of an event. They are biases that helped ancestors survive, tuned in the blueprint over many generations. Instinct stands near this doorway too. A young bird raised in isolation can still build a serviceable nest, not because it remembers watching a parent do it, but because its nervous system is primed for that behavior. Between that wide species memory and the narrow personal episode lies the territory where the genetic memory hypothesis lives. The most cited explanation in this middle ground is that life events can press small chemical marks onto the machinery that controls gene activity, and that some of those marks pass through egg and sperm to the next generation. Supporters of this view do not claim that entire scenes, a sunset over a river, a song heard in winter, can be inherited. They imagine something subtler. A dial shifted a little toward vigilance. If a parent was hurt, a dial shifted toward holding calories. If a grandparent starved, a heightened sensitivity to a particular odor. If a father had once learned to fear it. There are clear challenges to this story. Reprogramming in early development is fierce. Within days, as an embryo forms, most chemical tags are wiped clean and set again. If any survive, they do so by exception. That means that vivid transgenerational effects should be rare and selective, not common and sweeping. Many reported cases in lab animals fade after 1 or 2 generations, which fits that picture. And in people, life is too messy to draw clean lines. Maternal stress hormones cross the placenta. A frightened mother might speak less, sleep less, eat differently, hold her child more tightly or more distantly. Culture carries memory as efficiently as chemistry does, and sometimes more precisely. Another theory points to small genetic messengers carried in sperm and egg. These molecules do not change the letters of the genetic code, but they can whisper instructions as an embryo begins to divide. Stress or diet can change the mix of these messengers in a parent. If that signal is strong enough, it may push a developing child's stress circuits one direction or another. Evidence for this sits mostly in animal studies and is still under argument. It is a plausible bridge between an adult's experience and a child's wiring, but not yet a settled one. There is a wider frame that includes the familiar tools of learning. If a parent has a strong fear, even a quiet one, a child often learns it without a word. A father avoids dogs. A daughter notices. A mother tenses at loud voices. A son stiffens in parallel. This is not genetic memory at all, yet it feels the same on the inside because it shapes the brain early and powerfully. When a person later feels an unbidden pull away from something they were never taught to fear, they may rightly wonder where it came from. On the far edge sits an older idea from psychology that people share a set of deep archetypes, a common pattern book of images and stories that surface in dreams and art. It fits well with the feeling that certain symbols and places resonate before experience. It does not, however, rest on the kind of detailed mechanism that biology expects. The genetic code's job, as far as we can tell, is to guide the building of proteins and the orchestration of development, not to store a film reel of a grandparent's walk down a certain street. So what chain of events fits the facts we have and avoids claims that reach too far? A careful one would go like this. A parent undergoes a strong experience: fear, hunger, shock, prolonged stress. Their body responds, shifting hormones, metabolism, and, in some cells, the chemical marks that regulate genes. Some of these marks and messenger molecules find their way into egg or sperm. When a child begins to form, most tags are swept away, but a small number remain or are rewritten in a patterned way by those messenger molecules. They do not install a memory of a specific event. They nudge the developing brain's thresholds. Later, when that child meets a certain cue, a scent, a kind of stress, a hunger, their nervous system leans a degree or two in the direction their parent had to learn the hard way. In mice under glass and light, we can see the edges of this chain. In people, we can infer parts of it from history and careful measurement, but the middle links stay hidden by the noise of real life. There is one more note that belongs near the end, not the start. Claims that whole scenes pass in the genetic code from one generation to another, the way a book passes from hand to hand, do not have support in biology. Reports of remembered past lives or inherited exact facts are stories, not science. The versions of the genetic memory hypothesis that stand tallest in daylight are narrower and more modest. They deal in tendencies and sensitivities, not in fully formed memories. Even a modest mystery can change the way we look at a cradle. A child opens their eyes for the first time in the delivery room. The lights are bright. The air smells like the mix of antiseptic and cotton and human skin. Most of what will shape this life lies ahead. Faces, voices, streets, and rooms. But a few dials may already be set, turned by the unseen residue of what came before. The parent reaches out. The child grips a finger with a firm, reflexive hand. No inherited photograph passes between them. Only this, a body prepared in certain small ways by a line of living, in a world about to leave its own marks. To the volunteers in the small rooms, it felt ordinary. A film on a screen, a few questions, a memory reaching back for what it could. Then a week later, the same faces returned, sure of details that had never happened. This is the false memory experiments, how easily the mind invents the past. The modern story begins in the early 1970s, in psychology labs that preferred quiet rooms and repeatable tests. Researchers wanted to know how memory behaves when it is nudged, not by a shock or a loud bang, but by a single word in a question. The setup was neat and contained. Show people a brief film of a traffic accident, stop the projector, then ask what they had seen. The question changed from person to person. Some heard, "How fast were the cars going when they hit?" Others heard, "How fast were the cars going when they smashed?" That one substituted word, hit or smashed, moved estimates like a hand on a dial. When people returned about a week later, many who had been asked about smashing remembered broken glass scattered on the road. In the film, there had been none. Another version used slides of a car approaching an intersection. In the original scene, a clear red stop sign stood at the corner. Later, some participants read a sentence that casually mentioned a yield sign at the same place. When asked to choose which sign they had actually seen, a surprising share picked the yield sign that had never been there. Many felt confident about it. The investigators kept careful logs. First the film or slides, then the leading question or misleading sentence, then the test. The pattern held. Suggestion did not just sway a guess in the moment, it appeared to rewrite what people felt they remembered. As the years moved into the 1990s, the lab room changed, but the goal stayed. Test memory's boundaries with ordinary tools, family stories, photos, a quiet interview. In one well-known protocol, a researcher called a parent or an older sibling and gathered 3 true episodes from the participant's childhood: a family pet, a move to a new house, a favorite teacher. To that list, the researcher added one false episode: being lost in a busy shopping mall and rescued by a kind stranger. Over multiple interviews, participants were asked to recall each event in as much detail as they could. Many remembered the true ones, and roughly a quarter began recalling the false one too, adding touches that felt real to them. The size of the store, the shape of a fountain, the hand of an older woman leading them to a counter. The interviews were recorded with care. No threats, no bright lights, only a steady invitation to remember. The false memory grew in plain view. Photos sharpened the effect. In the early 2000s, A team of psychologists asked families for albums and, with permission, crafted a composite image of the participant as a child riding in a hot air balloon. It was technically convincing, a child's face placed into a believable scene, but it showed something that had never occurred. After a few sessions of study and gentle prompting, more than half of the participants reported at least a partial memory of the ride, and a good number described it with color and sequence. Who stood beside them, how the wind felt on the cheeks. In another set of trials, volunteers were primed with a glossy advertisement that depicted a costumed rabbit from a studio that never appears in a particular famous theme park. A surprising fraction later remembered meeting and hugging that character at the park as a child. An impossible scene felt possible, then familiar, then owned. Not all the work relied on images. Consider a simple list of words: bed, pillow, dream, nap, rest, night, dozing. People studied such lists and, after a pause, recalled as many words as they could. Very often, they confidently recalled a word that fit the theme but had never appeared. In this case, sleep. Memory, it seemed, stores the gist, then fills the gaps with what belongs. In everyday life, that habit saves time and helps us tell a coherent story. In a lab, the habit can be measured in a notebook. Real-world cases sharpen the stakes. Courtrooms rely on people standing, pointing, and saying, "I am sure." But legal reviews in the United States and elsewhere have shown that mistaken eyewitness identifications helped lead to many wrongful convictions, later overturned by genetic testing. Camera footage and time-stamped receipts discovered years after a trial would show the convicted person elsewhere. In several studies, simply telling a witness, "You picked the suspect," increased their later certainty, even when the person they had picked was not the culprit. Confidence was elastic. It could be inflated by feedback, and that inflation did not add accuracy. Police procedures in many places changed because of such findings. Lineups are now often conducted by someone who does not know who the suspect is, and witnesses are warned that the guilty person might not be present at all. Within the lab, the mechanics of false memory began to look less like trickery and more like the ordinary process of remembering. A memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. Each time you retrieve it, you rebuild it from scraps. The central picture, a few bright specifics, the general outline of how such events usually go. If, during that rebuild, a new detail arrives that fits the outline, it can become embedded. Over time, the new detail can feel as old as the rest. Several forces help that embedding along. Leading questions are: 1. What color was the man's hat? Presumes a hat, and a witness will often supply a color to match the presumption. Repetition is another. Telling the same story many times smooths its edges, but it also strengthens whatever errors have crept in along the way. Imagination sits nearby. If you spend a few minutes vividly imagining spilling a punch bowl at a family party, years later, you may feel that it happened, especially if the scene fits the place and people you truly knew. Researchers have documented what they call the inflation of belief after imagination. A person's confidence that an event occurred rises simply because they thought about it in detail. The social world exerts pressure too. Two witnesses talk in a hallway. One is certain of a blue jacket. The other, who had been unsure, now remembers it as blue as well. Memory conforms to the group, even if the group is just a pair of friends trying to be helpful. Therapists and loved ones can, without meaning to, plant seeds. In the late 1980s and early 90s, a wave of cases described long ago abuse recovered during therapy. Some of those accounts were supported by evidence, others, examined later, fell apart under careful scrutiny. The lesson the labs draw is not that the mind hides nothing, or that pain cannot be buried. It is that suggestive techniques can produce dramatic but unreliable memories, and that claims about the past need outside anchors, dates, travel records, letters, or other independent signs, especially when consequences are severe. Against all this, some caveats. The finding that memories are reconstructive does not mean memory is useless. People remember the core of important events quite well. A wedding, a fire, a birth. What fades and flexes are the trimmings, the time on the kitchen clock, the sequence of 2 phone calls, the color of a jacket in a crowd. Even so-called flashbulb memories, the kind formed during national shocks, shift in their details when people are re-interviewed years later. The sense of certainty is high. The match to the original scene is not perfect. So what chain of events best fits the experiments and the lived cases without reaching too far? It can be drawn step by step. A person attends to an event with limited attention because attention is always limited. The mind builds a working sketch and stores it. Later, that memory is brought back by a question, a conversation, a photograph, or a smell. During that retrieval, the mind uses its knowledge of how the world works to fill missing lines. If a question is leading, the fill is nudged. If a photo supplies an image, the image is adopted. When the memory is stored again, the new detail can be saved with the rest. Over repetitions, the boundary between original and added content blurs. Confidence grows because fluency grows. The story is easier to tell, and ease feels like truth. One rare but telling detail from the car crash studies deserves a closer look. When asked immediately after the film, people who heard smashed gave higher speed estimates, which fits the idea of a leading word affecting judgment. But the broken glass emerged only a week later at a delayed test. That delay matters. It suggests the false detail did not come from a quick guess, but from a change in the stored memory over time. The rewrite settled in quietly, then felt native on return. Food studies added a practical twist. In several experiments, researchers suggested to participants that, as children, they had gotten sick after eating a certain food. With careful wording and repeated gentle interviews, a portion of the group came to believe the new history. In later cafeteria choices, they avoided that food. The lab record shows not just a story reshaped, but a present-day decision altered by a past that never was. It is a reminder that memory does not simply live in a glass case. It guides what we order, whom we trust, what we teach our children to be wary of. There is room for humility here. Many families hold stories that were not written down, yet are true. Many people carry scars from events that were never photographed, yet happened. The existence of false memories does not cancel real ones, and the existence of memory's fragility does not mean nothing can be known. The careful response is to seek corroboration where possible and to treat confidence as a feeling, not a guarantee. The horizon continues to widen. Newer work explores how sleep stabilizes what we learn, sometimes strengthening the gist at the expense of small details. Other studies look at what happens when a memory is reawakened and becomes pliable for a short time. A phase when, in theory, a skilled question can help correct an error, or, poorly used, can make it worse. Technology adds its own puzzles. A stream of photos on a phone can make minor days vivid and important days blend. When later asked, what we remember may be what we saw in pictures, not what we saw in life. The mystery at the heart of these experiments is not supernatural. It is human. Why does a mind that can remember a face for decades or a path home at midnight also invent a shopping mall episode that never occurred? Because the mind's job is not to store a perfect archive. It is to build a usable story of the world with the pieces available. Most of the time, that story serves us. Sometimes it deceives us with a straight face. Imagine a hallway table with a few framed photographs. Some are originals, some were copied years ago on a different paper. One is a careful reconstruction from an old negative. Together they make a family history you can point to. You pass them every evening. You know them by heart. But if someone swapped one with a close imitation, the same pose a slightly brighter day, would you notice at a glance? Memory lives there, in that small uncertainty, doing its best. It keeps us oriented. It tells us who we have been, and now and then, it invents a step we never took and makes it feel like our own. A hallway, a kitchen, a station platform. You turn your head, catch the second hand on a wall clock, and for a breath, it seems to halt, as if time itself forgot to move. Then the tick returns, steady as ever. Most people have seen it once or twice, and some see it almost every day. This is the chronostasis illusion, the stopped clock that never stopped. In everyday terms, chronostasis is the feeling that the first glance at a clock shows a frozen moment, a long first second that should not be long at all. The longer you look, the more normal it seems. The odd stretch sits right at the start, like a hitch in a step you only notice after you've taken it. The modern story begins at the turn of the 2000s in vision labs that studied quick eye movements and the timing of perception. The setups were simple and careful. A volunteer sat with chin on a rest to keep the head steady. A small light gave a starting point, and a clock face. Sometimes a real one with a stepping second hand. Sometimes a simulated one on a screen, sat a short distance away. On a cue, the volunteer flicked their eyes from the light to the clock. The researchers asked how long the first second on the clock felt, or whether it seemed longer than the ones that followed. It did, by a surprising margin. Across repeats, that first interval often felt stretched by a few tenths of a second, sometimes close to half a second, after a large eye movement. The size of the stretch tended to grow with the size of the eye jump. The clock itself was not unusual. No hidden motor slowed it. The extension lived in the observer's experience. A few details anchor the effect. Our eyes do not slide smoothly from one point to another. Several times each second, they snap from target to target in quick jumps called saccades. During each jump, the image on the retina streaks across the light-sensitive tissue so fast it would produce a smear, so the brain dampens the input. For a very brief time, a sliver of a second, vision is down-regulated. You do not see the blur of your own eye movement. You see what came before, then what came after, and your mind keeps the world stable. Chronostasis appears, where that stability trick intersects with an event you can measure. The first tick you see after the eye lands. If the brain fills in the missing time by backdating the moment the world began again, then the first event after the movement will feel like it began earlier than it did. Imagine you arrived at the clock a tenth of a second ago, but your mind lays the start of your arrival a little earlier, covering the gap. The first second absorbs the extra. It seems to linger. To test this, researchers varied nearly everything you can think of. They asked people to glance to clocks at different angles, so the eye jumps were shorter or longer. They used stepping second hands and smooth sweeping ones. They swapped the clock for a ring of dots that lit up in turns. They added a tone, marking a moment in sound. They synchronized a click with the clock so that the eye movement, the visual tick, and the auditory marker could be compared. The pattern held in a specific way. The more dramatic the eye jump, the more the first interval stretched. With sweeping second hands, where there is no sharp onset, the effect weakened. With stepping hands or a changing digit, it was strong. What made the case more interesting and less tied to vision alone was what happened when labs tried other senses. Volunteers reached to touch a surface and, as the hand landed, judged how long a brief vibration lasted. Many reported a longer first vibration. In other experiments, people turned their heads toward a sound source and judged the length of the first tone they heard after the turn. Again, a similar stretch. The eye was not the only door where time widened. The illusion followed the shift of attention and the start of a new fixation, as if one internal clock tried to cover the handoff between moments. If the goal is to build a detective's chain, we can lay it out step by step. First, each glance to a clock includes a silent moment while your eyes are in motion. You are not blind in a dramatic sense, but visual detail is reduced, which spares you a smear of movement across the scene. Second, when your eyes land, your mind does not simply start fresh. It stitches the world together. The impression of a steady room, a stable clock, is built in part by adjusting when the new look is said to have begun. In effect, your brain writes the start time a little earlier than the physical landing. Third, A sharp, repeating event, the second hand stepping, a digit changing, a brief tone, serves as a ruler for your sense of duration. That first event captures the extra time you never saw during the eye jump, and so it seems to last longer. Fourth, as soon as you have a few of those events in sequence, your sense of time settles back into a normal rhythm. Only the first one carries the load of the missing instant. Against this, people sometimes propose a simpler idea. Novelty stretches time. The first thing after a movement is simply more salient, and salient things feel longer. There is a cousin to this in psychology called the oddball effect, where an unexpected image in a stream of repeated images is judged to last longer than the rest. But the chronostasis records do not reduce neatly to novelty. The size of the stretch tracks the size of the eye movement. If researchers keep the visual scene just as interesting each time, and only change how far the eyes have to jump, the long first second grows and shrinks with the jump. Novelty alone doesn't predict that. Another angle focuses on attention. When we shift from one item to another, our attention lags, then locks on. Perhaps the lag or the lock reshapes our timing. There is truth here. Attention is part of any measurement the mind makes. But again, the cross-sense findings complicate a simple attentional account. The stretch shows up when you reach with a hand, not just when you shift your gaze. It shows up when you reorient to a sound. If attention were the only cause, changing the effector, eyes versus hand versus head, should scramble the pattern. Instead, a familiar shape appears, a brief gap, a handoff, and a backdated start. A third set of ideas borrows from a broad principle. Perception sometimes uses later information to interpret earlier moments. In plain language, the mind edits. A flitting bird passes behind a tree and reappears, and you experience a smooth path behind the trunk you never saw, because the later reappearance confirms the path. In timing, a similar edit may occur. The brain waits a fraction of a second to gather enough evidence about the new fixation, then assigns that evidence to the start of the look. Researchers sometimes call this postdiction, not prediction. This does not mean the world is remade. It means the story your mind tells about the last half second uses information from the full half second, not just the front part. The details of the edit have limits. If you stare at a clock and do not move your eyes, the second hand will not stretch itself for you. If you look back and forth between two items that do not offer a clean, discrete change, say a smooth, sweeping hand, the effect weakens or disappears. If you use a digital clock that refreshes quietly without a clear step, the illusion becomes harder to trigger. It prefers sharp onsets. And even with the best conditions, the long second is measured in fractions, not in whole seconds. The clock never stops. It never even pauses. Your mind simply credits it with more time than it had, just once, at the moment you arrived. There are a few rare practical notes. People who rely on quick glances Air traffic controllers, athletes, drivers checking a speedometer, and road signs live in a world full of saccades. Most will not notice chronostasis because the day carries you along, and timelines are anchored by more than a single tick. But in tasks that demand precise timing at the first glance, the illusion could tug subtly. Some labs tried to pin down whether fatigue, caffeine, or age change its size. Results are mixed and small. The core remains, a brief stretch linked to the jump of the eyes or a shift of attention. One might ask whether instruments capture any of this. Cameras do not, because they do not have to stitch between blind moments. They do not blink when they pan. Computers only show what is there at their refresh rates. The strangeness belongs to us, to the way a living system protects continuity by smoothing gaps. It is not deception in the moral sense. It is housekeeping, done fast and mostly out of sight. Another question is whether the effect is just a lab curiosity shaped by careful setups. The answer lives in kitchens and bus stops. Try it. Look away from an analog clock to a distant corner. Then snap your eyes back to the second hand just before it steps. For many, the hand seems to hesitate, then resume. If the clock uses a smooth sweep, the moment will be less obvious, but a digital change on a watch can do the same. The first number seems to sit a little just after you arrive. That small private experiment points to the broader theme that makes chronostasis a quiet classic among perceptual mysteries. The most reliable machines we know, clocks and metronomes, feel malleable when filtered through us. The physics is firm, the tick is regular, yet our reading of it slides by a fraction when we move. In most of life, this is a kindness. It spares us blur and disorientation. At the edge, it reminds us that our timeline is constructed, not just received. Some listeners may wonder about bolder claims, that time itself slows in danger, that a sudden fright makes the world go into slow motion. The research here draws a careful line. In many such cases, people report the experience of more detail, as if more snapshots were taken. When scientists try to measure whether the world actually appeared in slow motion at the time, results favor a different story. The memory of the event is richer afterward, not stretched in the moment. Chronostasis, by contrast, lives right at the edge of action. It is measurable during the event, tied to a movement and an onset, and it fades as quickly as it came. So what most likely happens when the clock seems to stop? A simple chain fits best. Your eyes jump, vision dips. You arrive at the clock. Your brain writes the start of this new view slightly earlier to hide the gap. The first tick absorbs the hidden slice of time and feels longer. Then everything returns to baseline. The machine on the wall never broke rhythm. You did a small edit on the fly so the world would look continuous. There is something steadying in that. The illusion does not accuse the clock. It describes us. It says that in the space of a heartbeat, we do the work of making moments join. And that work leaves a small signature you can catch if you know where to look. Late evening, a quiet room, a clock on the far wall. You glance down to a cup and back again. For a brief stretch, the second hand seems to hold still, as if waiting for you to catch up. Then it ticks and carries on. The chronostasis. Illusion passes, time continues, and the room is unchanged, except for the faint knowledge that, for a fraction of a second, your mind adjusted the world and did it so well you almost didn't notice. And so we end where we began, with the mind watching itself, chasing its own patterns through thought and time. We've met people who saw without seeing, remembered things that never happened, and reached flow so complete that self and moment disappeared together. We've seen how imagination can summon what belief alone should never make real, and how even a ticking clock can lie to our perception of time. Each story leaves a quiet question. If our senses, memories, and awareness can all deceive us, then what exactly can we trust? Maybe the answer isn't certainty at all, but curiosity, the steady willingness to keep exploring the mind, even when it loops back on itself. Because every illusion, every glitch, every sudden moment of wonder tells us something about what it means to be conscious at all. As you settle deeper into rest, let the questions drift too, not for solving, but for holding softly, like stones at the bottom of a river. Tomorrow they will still be there, waiting. But for now, the mysteries can keep watch, and you can let go. Good night, and thanks for letting me keep you company.